But it's a real privilege to be here today. Thank you for having us, and thank you for coming down to see some of the work that we've done. So my name is Joshua Doyle, Placemaking Coordinator at Dunbartonshire Council. Have I got a flicker? Okay. And my colleague Seb is our GIS officer. If there are any very technical, difficult questions afterwards, please direct them towards Seb and not myself. So we are here to just talk about some of the work we've been doing with 20-minute neighbourhoods over the past kind of 6 to 9 months or so. So the idea, concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods is not a new one, but it was first introduced in Scotland in 2020, more as a kind of aspiration rather than necessarily a policy position. But as Roddy mentioned, this has somewhat evolved into the draft MPF4, and through that we've got a little bit more detail of how the government view the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods. You know, it's not necessarily new, but it's the basic principle of being able to access your key daily needs within a reasonable walking and wheeling distance, which is referred to in a Scottish context and in the MPF4 as 800 metres. I'm not necessarily here to talk about the kind of mechanics of the concept itself. That's a whole other conversation, but more how we've responded to that at a local level. But there is lots of evidence from lots of other international examples which kind of look to improve quality of life, reduce unsustainable modes of travel, and respond to climate emergency. A lot of these are obviously huge aspirations, but just by way of one example, which I think is really interesting, which is over a quarter of Scotland's emissions are from transport, and as you can see, a big portion of those are from private car journeys. Nearly 40% of those private car journeys are less than 2 miles in distance. So if we can start to move towards an idea of living more locally, we can make not just kind of impact over a long period of time, but potentially in the short term as well. So as the placemaking coordinator at Dunbartonshire Council, and the sole placemaking coordinator, I was kind of left with the task of 20-minute neighbourhoods. You know, can you work with that really from our local level? So I kind of did the reasonable thing and went and looked at as many examples from all over the world of this as an idea. Some of them come with different names, but fundamentally they all look to an idea of living more locally, from 15-minute cities in Paris to ideas in Melbourne. There is the Utrecht barcode, all the way down to 5-minute cities in Copenhagen. Obviously, Copenhagen always go the next level. And really armed with kind of an overwhelming amount of information from all of these international examples, we're kind of left with the question of, where do we start? Where do we begin? How do we use this concept in West Dunbartonshire as a couple of officers trying to work with this as an idea? And having spoke to lots of other colleagues in different councils, I think it's a question that other colleagues are asking as well. And I suppose kind of pondering with this question for quite a while, realised that actually the kind of answer was there from the starting point, which is where do we actually start? We need to, before we can suggest any sort of intervention under the umbrella of 20-minute neighbourhoods, we need to understand where we're going to do that, how are we going to do that, who are we working with, where are our existing services, where are our communities, and how do they access them? And so that led us down a path of, well, actually the key variables of a 20-minute neighbourhood that is very, very basic core are measurable. We're looking at address points and we're looking at services, and really it's about how do we define the relationship between them. But importantly, the variable of time is kind of critical, obviously, being a 20-minute neighbourhood. The anecdote I kind of often refer to is if your GP surgery is on the other side of the M8, it's close in distance, but it's not close in time, which importantly means that we have to be able to use a network function, a network-based measurement of how you access services from different residential points to give a genuinely true representation of the relationship. So this led to a series of questions which I put to our very, very talented and capable GIS officer, Seb, which started with, can we simply measure these things to start with? Do we have the data to measure the residential points? Do we have the data to measure all of our service areas? From that, I asked him, okay, but can we do that using different distances and also critically using the network of roads and routes that are available? And importantly, and probably most importantly, can we do that in a way which is dynamic and support and inform decision-making at a local level? This is not a post-rationalized set of questions for this presentation. We genuinely went through and discussed that we can't do this work just for it to be interesting. We have to do this work so that it supports our colleagues in different service areas to make better decisions with regards to this idea. So Seb went away, as he would, and came back far quicker than my ego would like to admit to, with basically a proof of concept using, obviously, our mapping software. So it's relatively simple, off-the-shelf ArcGIS capabilities, where we've taken the education sites in Dunbarton, used a network measure away from all of the sites for 800 metres, obviously using the roads and routes that are actually available, create a catchment, so we have a genuine understanding of what the catchment of those education facilities are, and then from that overlaid all of the unique residential points to give, in effect, proof of concept to say, well, yeah, we can actually understand which of these points have access to education sites using the basic metric of 20-minute neighbourhoods and the specific context of Dumbarton and the routes that are available. So what do we then measure? This is as big a task, I think, as the technical aspect of being able to measure, which is every single council is going to have to define their own version of what is a 20-minute neighbourhood, and fundamentally, every person is going to have their own version of what a 20-minute neighbourhood is. But I don't think that means that it's not an exercise that is worth doing. We've evolved over time to kind of create a series of indicators, as you can see, that refer to relatively typical measures of services. Initially, we started with a pilot that had 9 indicators, which then evolved into a second version, which had 14 indicators, and then working closely with our colleagues, we now have a version which has got 19 indicators, and we're now at the level of kind of talking about different types of educations, for example. So it's not just the primary school, we're talking about denominational and non-denominational primary schools. So because of, obviously, the demographics that we serve in our council area. Behind all of that is, of course, all of the difficult work that Seb has to do in gathering all of those data sources, and I put it in a nice diagram. But I think the important reason for showing this is that at a local level, we have access to a huge amount of data, which actually at a national level, it maybe isn't there as much. So it's not necessarily that we have anything that maybe other people don't have, it's just that we chose to look at it and use it in a different way. So I'm going to just run you through the tool, our current version of the tool at the moment. So obviously using a simple dashboard which we view online, so I can share that with colleagues across the council. Seb can talk about that with colleagues across the council. We've got a relatively simple dashboard with the amount of residential properties that are currently on screen, the indicators proportionally as to what's on screen. So the idea, I hope that's come through. So of course, every instance of every indicator is then mapped. So we have, in effect, a little service area for every point of primary school, GP, etc. And of course, at this moment in time, that's not very legible, it's not very usable. But by simply using a kind of binary ones and zeros of where each residential point has access or crosses or overlaps with those service areas, we can create in effect, what is a heat map. And obviously what we're looking to try and achieve is green and hopefully move away from red. Importantly, it's probably interesting to note that none of the current properties in the council area hit all 19 indicators, which is another conversation in itself. But this gives us a genuine metric. So, of course, it's based on a series of inputs with regards to assumptions about a 20-minute neighbourhood, and there are lots of qualitative elements that need to be brought into this, but it does give us a genuine metric. And importantly, we can click on any point and we can see why that point isn't performing with regards to these metrics. So, simply we can start to say, actually, there is a real shortage of access to open space in that area. That gives us the ability to go and talk to our open space team and make some suggestions. Of course, underneath all of this, all of our mapping is all of the SIMD data, which is brought in because we're not naive to the complexity that happens within neighbourhoods and communities and towns, and the deprivation indicators need to be almost read in conjunction with any of these assumptions as well. So, that's a critical point. Another interesting thing that we're able to do as well, because we work with service areas from the service itself rather than working from the residential points out, is that we're actually able to talk about density, which I think is something which is not necessarily talked about very regularly within 20-minute neighbourhoods. We have to be able to build at a certain density to support certain services. We can't just put a GP on every corner so that everybody has access to it. So the idea of being able to talk about density as well as being able to talk about access is a really critical element. So just to kind of circle a little bit background. Excuse me. How does any of this really support any decision making at a local level? And what are we doing with this at the moment? It's still a relatively simple tool, and neither Seb or I will claim that it's the answer to everybody's problems, but already at a local level, we're able to use the tool with different service areas. So we're including the tool and some of the analysis from the tool in development briefs that go out with the sale of any land now. So instead of just selling a red line boundary with some vague policy positions that relate to it, we're able to actually include not only the type of use for the site, the proximity to different services may impact the type of housing, for example, that might come forward, the typology of housing. Is it family housing or is it actually a different typology? We're actually starting to be able to suggest, you have massively good access to public transport, trains, bus stops, so actually can we look at reducing car parking for that site? So this information is starting to go out, and we're kind of working upstream with this information to embed it within the discussions about how a site maybe comes forward in the future. One of our colleagues, Matthew, is doing some really great work as well, where he's now taken the work we've doing and evolved it into working with vacant and derelict land. So we've mapped every vacant and derelict land site within the council, and he's looking at how the service provision can help influence how these sites are brought forward and developed. This is an example from a completely different scale of intervention. This is working with our colleagues in capital projects and education for the delivery of a new education campus in the council area. They talked about working with 20-minute neighbourhoods, and we kind of asked them, okay, well, what is your 20-minute neighbourhood? And they kind of, to be fair to them, said, we're not really sure yet. So we helped them by showing them what the tool would show. But, really, really simple example, that the image on the right shows that because of the scale of the site, just by adding an additional entrance to the rear of the site and taking advantage of an already established route through a green space that was already lit, you could expand the catchment of a 20-minute neighbourhood to include a couple of hundred houses. Now, of course, that isn't a silver bullet. It's just that's not it finished. But what that's been really interesting is that that's made the kind of idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods is taking it from a abstract concept down to a tangible idea that a client team not only are now working with, but they're the ones, professing that this is what they need to do to all of their consultants who are working on the project. So they're taking this and kind of running with it as well, and that's really great to see. We're also doing some other pieces of work, which is with our housing team. We're looking at their future pipeline of sites and assessing how they perform with regards to access to key services. We're working with our health and social care partnership to see if we can kind of work through the correlation between health and access, which is of course very complicated. And we're also working with our colleagues in Working for You to see if we can find the correlation between access to services, which in effect becomes access to a jobs market, and then employability support. And they're actually really keen to see how they can do a kind of targeted employability support rather than necessarily trying to work with the entire council boundary in all aspects. And I just wanted to finish with a couple of learnings. Of course, every time Seb and I find a new bit of data, or we talk to someone else that's doing something similar, we learn something new. To be completely honest, every time we compare one layer to another layer, we learn something new, which then leads to me knocking on someone's door to say, have you seen this, by the way? But I kind of wanted to finish with maybe just a couple of kind of overarching learnings, which is when we create this data and the mapping tool, it doesn't provide us with the answers, but it helps us to ask better questions. And of course, it's a little bit like a Darwinian tree. Every time you ask the one question, it leads to 3 more, and each one of those leads to another 3. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask the first question. If we want to genuinely move towards 20-minute neighbourhoods, we have to ask those questions, and we have to be able to answer them. And the way we've started to use data and the mapping tool internally is to kind of refer to it almost like a lens. It's not necessarily the answer, but by using it as a lens, it can help to support the conversation with our other colleagues, with our senior team, which then means we can support the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods and enable us to work towards the aspirations that it can deliver. Thank you.